This is part 2, episode 72. Purple light flashed, and these tiny seeds flew far away into the distance. Nobody knew what the delicate silk immortal had in mind for them. There's no reaction at all. Hui Yuhao immediately channeled and circulated his soul power, after ingesting those droplets, as he protected his internal organs. Hui Yuhao didn't dare to delay. He sat down cross-legged and quietly felt all the delicate changes that were happening to his body. It didn't take long before the thing he was waiting for arrived. The refreshing sensations extended across his entire body at first, but that feeling gradually started to withdraw and follow his veins through his limbs as they traveled upward towards his head. This poison targets the head. Hui Yuhao felt his heart skip a beat. The brain was the most intricate part of the human body, and it was also the most important part, as the spiritual sea was located inside the brain. If toxins damaged the brain, even if he survived the ordeal, he could lose his rationality and his ability to think. Hui Yuhao controlled his soul power, and his soul power immediately congregated into 7 defensive lines at breakneck speed. These defensive lines webbed over his body in an attempt to block that fresh and chilly feeling from pushing up into his head. He reached downward with his spiritual power at the same time and combined it with his soul power, so that he could make use of the sovereign descent's mystical effects. From Hui Yuhao's perspective, fusing his soul power and his spiritual power provided an all-round defense, and was probably enough to barricade that peculiar herb's effects. However, Hui Yuhao realized he was wrong when the refreshing sensation surged up into his head. The herb's effects didn't travel along his passageways like his soul power did. The sensation had integrated into his veins, and it circulated through his body along with his blood. Hui Yuhao reacted quickly once he discovered this, and he swiftly sealed off his veins and passageways. This response was effective. His veins stopped circulating, and since the herb's effects were sealed within his veins, they also stopped flowing through his body. Hui Yuhao heaved a faint sigh of relief, but he quickly realized that he was just being daft. How long could he seal off his veins and passageways? Completely sealing off his veins meant that he was stopping his heart from beating. Even though he was a powerful soul king, he could probably only keep this up for several minutes before he would die from the lack of oxygen. If the herb's effects were concentrated in one place, he could let blood from his body into that area, so that he could expel the toxin from his body. However, the problem was that the herb's effects were pouring in from every single part of his body. That meant that there was no way he could completely expel the toxin from his body unless he drained every single ounce of blood that he had. What kind of herb is this? It's so fierce and formidable. Hui Yuhao's mind began to work at lightning speed as countless thoughts surfaced in his mind in an attempt to find a solution. However, his efforts were futile. He couldn't find an appropriate response for this problem. He had now kept his veins sealed for a little too long, and he began to feel weak and suffocated. He couldn't keep this up for much longer. That's it, looks like I can only take the hit. Hui Yuhao recalled what Skydream had just said to him, that toxins were useless as long as he was around the delicate silk immortal. Since that was the case, then it was possible that the delicate silk immortal hadn't given him poison. If so, then what could possibly happen to him if the herb's effects integrated with his body? He could only truly feel how it would affect his body through the integration process. Hui Yuhao felt as if his spirit eyes were being continuously rinsed by a peculiar force, as if something was being continuously injected inside them. What confused him was the fact that he didn't feel any agonizing sensations at all, and though he tried everything to make this feeling disappear, nothing worked. He couldn't do anything even when he sealed off his veins and blood flow. Does she want to obliterate my spirit eyes? That was what Hui Yuhao was most afraid of. However, he was already stuck in this situation, and the only thing he could do was channel his soul and spiritual power, and do all he could to protect his spirit eyes. His spirit eyes were neither fragile nor weak. They were his main martial soul, and had been cultivated constantly through the purple demon eyes, so they could in fact be considered powerful and formidable. Simply put, even if Hui Yuhao's eyes were stabbed by normal metal, it was unlikely they would be hurt. Spiritual power circulated around and through his spirit eyes. The refreshing sensations, backflow and absorption seemed extremely quick, and the feelings gradually disappeared. Hui Yuhao became increasingly nervous. He was most afraid that this peculiar force would erupt again after integrating into his body and completely destroy his spirit eyes. The clean and fresh feeling slowly became fiery warmth. His eyes felt as if they were being bathed in lukewarm water, and his soul power and spiritual power became supplements for absorbing the herb's effects. Hu Yuhao didn't feel any pain, nor did he experience the eruption that he was expecting. Instead, he could feel an unprecedented degree of comfort in his eyes. The energy that had been injected into his eyes was nourishing his spirit eyes, and every pulse of absorption made him feel incredibly comfortable. Is this actually a harmful herb? Doubt finally surfaced in Hu Yuhao's mind. Can it be that I am that person's chosen one, the person that the delicate silk immortal speaks of? It seems like my judgment was correct. Uncle Niu Qian dared to send me here, and that means I should be able to pass the assessment in front of me. His anxiety slowly faded, and he began to regain his composure. Hu Yuhao continued channeling his soul power and spiritual power as he began to catalyze his absorption of the herb's medicinal effects. The girl that he had knocked unconscious came to right at this moment. Wang Qiu'er possessed the golden dragon martial soul, and her physical capabilities were extremely powerful, and Hu Yuhao hadn't used that much force when he sliced down on her neck. It didn't take too long before she naturally recovered by herself. Wang Qiu'er couldn't be bothered with being angry when she saw Hu Yuhao sitting on the ground with his legs crossed. She didn't even have to think to guess what he had done. "You're such an idiot." Wang Qiu'er cursed under her breath, her large pinkish-blue eyes full of worry and anxiety. She targeted the delicate silk immortal in the next moment, and pointed the golden dragon spear in her hands as she exclaimed, What did you give him?" The delicate silk immortal giggled and said, "I have given him something good, of course. But I won't give it to you even if you want it." Wang Qiu'er said coldly, "Listen, if something happens to him, I will make sure you die right where you are even if I have to pay with my life. I may even destroy everything else in this place. You'd better pray that nothing happens to him." "Calm down. I didn't give him anything bad," the delicate silk immortal explained hurriedly, as if she were a little fearful of Wang Qiu'er now. "You didn't give him anything bad?" Wang Qiu'er asked doubtfully. "No." The delicate silk immortal continued, "That person left this rule behind all those years ago, and this rule is targeted at the people who come to this place in search of medicine and herbs to save someone's life. The truth is that there isn't a fixed herb for all these adventurers, and I choose the herb on a case-by-case basis. First, I have to be sure that the adventurer is here to save a life, and then I have to see whether the adventurer has the courage to consume the herb that I'll eventually give him. If the adventurer decides to consume this herb, that proves he or she has the courage, and this adventurer is willing to sacrifice his or her own life to save someone else. I will approve of a person like this, and this adventurer will be worthy of undergoing the subsequent assessment." Wang Qiu'er's eyes grew vacant as her jaw hung slack. What's going on? She turned back towards Hu Yuhao, where she saw a scarlet gold sphere hovering above his head, while scarlet gold light threads gradually wove and integrated themselves into his eyes. The delicate silk immortal said, "That person said that this is a test of a person's personality, and a person cannot be evil if he or she is willing to sacrifice his or her life for someone else. Yes, he's courageous enough, and I've given him a mystical herb that's extremely suitable for him, and he should be thanking me. Please don't use that ability that you just showed me. Even though it's likely that we won't be able to resist it, you will definitely die along with us." The water inside his spiritual sea was originally golden, but there was now a blurry purple layer of light hovering above it. Both colors merged together to become a beautiful hue of purple gold. Hu Yuhao's entire spiritual sea was now in his grasp when he willed it so, and even Skydream, who had transformed into a ring on his finger, had a faint purple layer encircling him. The vertical eye above his spiritual sea that represented the eye of destiny didn't change much. That also meant that the herb had only affected his spirit eyes. Hu Yuhao slowly opened his eyes after the last of the herb's effects had been assimilated. He realized to his intense shock that the world had become entirely different when he perceived it again. The world around him seemed to be a lot more colorful than before. His eyes could detect the most delicate and intricate changes in his surroundings, and he could see the peculiarities of every detail even when he didn't release his martial soul. Hu Yuhao looked up at the sky above him. What he saw wasn't those rainbow-colored poison clouds. Instead, he saw countless minute particles, and he could distinguish each particle's color even though he was quite far from them. Hu Yuhao turned back towards the delicate silk immortal, and he realized that he could see the vast life energy circulating inside her. This life energy was a faint pink color, and it wove continually between her petals, stamen, and neck. He could even see what the energy undulations were like in the lake behind her. Hu Yuhao released his spirit eyes. He subconsciously wanted to try and see how his body would react with his spirit eyes activated, and he discovered that time began to slow. Hu Yuhao scrutinized everything with his spirit eyes. Not only did everything become a lot clearer than before, but everything seemed to also slow down. This sensation was just too strange to the point where he almost couldn't believe what he was seeing. What he had just ingested wasn't a harmful herb, it was a mystical herb that was exceedingly beneficial for his spirit eyes. This feeling clearly represented the purple demon eye's highest level. Of the purple demon eye's 4 different realms, Hui Yu Hao had already reached the 3rd realm. However, he had now ferociously broken through the 3rd realm to reach the final realm, mustard seed. The ability to see even the smallest details represented the highest possible realm. Furthermore, his spiritual power also began to evolve along with his spirit eyes. When your spiritual power has form, but no substance, you can even use spiritual power to suppress your ultimate eye soul power. And you can envelop your soul power when you cultivate, so that it will no longer affect your body. Your cultivation speed will no longer be affected by ultimate ice, not in the least. Your cultivation speed after this can even surpass that of normal soul masters, while every single spiritual type, soul skill that you possess, has undergone a qualitative change as well. You can absorb another portion of the spiritual origin that I've sealed away in your spiritual sea. I will help you with that when we return, so that you can completely consolidate your position in this realm. When you have cultivated long enough that you've reached the pinnacle of this realm, then you can attempt to break through into the realm where your spiritual power has both form and substance. Once you've reached that stage, nobody else in the world can challenge you in terms of spiritual power. This pleasant surprise was simply too great. Hui Yu Hao's spiritual power had been strengthened exponentially, while his overall abilities had also risen by an entire level. Even though his soul power wasn't boosted at all, his spiritual power had changed qualitatively to the point where he had reached the metaphysical realm, and that meant improvements in his soul power weren't that far away. Hey, are you all right? An extremely displeased voice suddenly jolted Hui Yu Hao awake from his pleasant surprise. Wang Qiu'er had seen him open his eyes, and then she realized that he was just smiling foolishly to himself. Wang Qiu'er was startled when his eyes began to shine with a faint purplish golden light that began to extend outwards, because she had a feeling as though she was completely naked and exposed to a certain someone's vision. The feeling of being stripped naked didn't feel so good, and Hui Yu Hao's pupils had also begun to undergo some peculiar transformations. His pupils were originally pure black in color, but there now seemed to be another pupil within them. This pupil was purple, and the 2 pupils in a single eye became purple and gold when he released his spirit eyes. Everything looked extremely strange and peculiar. Is this your body-soul's second awakening? Wang Qiu'er asked in surprise. Hui Yu Hao was momentarily stunned. My body-soul's second awakening? I don't think so. Wang Qiu'er handed him a mirror. Look at your eyes. Why would there be such a tremendous transformation if your body-soul hasn't been awakened for the second time? Hui Yu Hao was also overcome with astonishment when he took the mirror and stared at his own pupils. I have 4 pupils now. I actually have polychoria. This is the White Tiger Duke's iconic polychoria. Wang Qiu'er was taken aback, and her eyes immediately grew sharp. She understood now, the delicate silk immortal had made things very clear. If Hui Yu Hao hadn't chosen to risk his life to ingest that herb, they would probably have faced an all-out assault from the plant-type soul beasts around the Icefire Yin-Yang well. There was no need to discuss the other plants around them, as the 100,000-year delicate silk immortal herself wasn't a force that they could deal with. In other words, Hui Yu Hao's impulsiveness had actually saved their lives. Hui Yu Hao's expression was calm. His spiritual sea had been boosted once more, and his mind had become more transparent and clearer than before. That outcome was something that he had guessed would happen, so it didn't come as a surprise to him. Hui Yu Hao heaved a sigh and said, It seems like I've been blessed with a fortuitous opportunity among all the dangers and perils. That means, Yu, I don't have to thank you. What I want to know is, what test will I have to go through after this? What test will I have to complete to obtain that book? The delicate silk immortal puffed indignantly and said, You should still thank me. Look, the full moon piercing autumn dew I chose for you is so compatible with you. Even though the full moon piercing autumn dew can't be considered the best magical herb around here, it's still ranked amongst the immortal herbs, and it's also one of the most appropriate herbs for you in this place. Furthermore, it's the easiest to absorb. I didn't let you feel any pain or suffering at all. Hui Yu Hao forced a laugh and said, But I've sustained a lot of emotional pain. All right, thank you, then. You can tell me about the test I have to go through now. The delicate silk immortal was satisfied as she said, That's better. The test before this has proven that your personality is trustworthy. That means, the subsequent test will be about your abilities. You can't protect this book even if you have it if you're not strong enough, yes. Therefore, according to what that person said, you have to display sufficient ability before you can take this book. You will have to fight against a soul beast suitable for your level to prove that you have sufficient strength. This combat. Wait, can you get to the point? Hui Yu Hao had no choice but to interrupt the delicate silk immortal, as she was just too long-winded. If he were to let her continue like this, he would probably start feeling dizzy by the time there was a conclusion. The delicate silk immortal grunted and said, "It hasn't been easy for me to find someone to talk to, and you're not going to let me talk more. Do you have any courtesy left in you? HMPH. I will choose a strong one for you, then. Ah Jiao, are you there? Please answer me if you are. Ah Jiao." Hui Yuhao's eyes focused, and a strange event occurred. The 4 pupils in his eyes flickered at the same time, and his dual pupils fused together, with the purple pupil behind and his black pupil in front. The purple pupil was slightly larger, and it appeared as if his black pupil had a purple light around it. Hui Yuhao and Wang Qiu'er were both highly resistant to heat, but they could still feel heat waves smacking them in the face, and they instinctively channeled their soul power to fight against them. The delicate silk immortal said, "Ah Jiao, can't you see that we have visitors? You shall conduct this assessment. I can lift a burden off my chest if he can pass this test." The plant referred to as Ah Jiao answered, "What burden do you have to lift? Isn't it just about the crystals that we have cultivated for many years? I sincerely hope that nobody comes to visit us." The delicate silk immortal giggled and said, "What's wrong with that? We don't have any use for the crystals even if we keep them. Furthermore, he may not even pass your test. Without that person's help all those years ago, we would have ceased to exist. Why do you have to be so petty? If you are that unwilling, then I will let aniseed do it. This will prove that aniseed is more powerful than you are." "Nonsense. How is that scoundrel stronger than me? It's obvious that I'm stronger, so you shut up. Come here, little boy, and let me teach you a lesson. Please bugger off from this place as soon as you lose." The fiery red plant trembled, and a red beam of light soared from her body into the sky. A strange scene appeared. The dense vegetation in the valley suddenly opened a path as the plants on the ground separated to either side, and a path was created all the way from the delicate silk immortal to where the fiery red plant was located. The delicate silk immortal said to Hui Yuhao, Go. Ah Jiao's temper isn't so good, and she is known as the blazing delicate apricot. She's a fire-type immortal herb, and she's extremely hot. Furthermore, you will be affected by the blazing sunspring when you're fighting over there." Hui Yuhao laughed bitterly and said, "She is 100,000-year soul beast, and I only have 5 soul rings. She has every advantage possible. Doesn't that mean I'm just throwing my life away if I carry on with this test?" The delicate silk immortal said, "Are you stupid? I never said that you have to defeat her. All you have to do is pass the test. Quickly, now. You cannot ask me how you can pass this test, as everyone does it differently. It's all up to you now." The ice-fire yin-yang well comprised 2 lakes, but its surface area wasn't that big. Hui Yuhao stepped forward steadily and quickly followed the path to where the blazing delicate apricot was located. The blazing delicate apricot was clearly a lot fiercer than the delicate silk immortal was. Not a single plant grew within 200 feet around her, and the plants that lived beyond 200 feet were mostly red, or close to red. There was no question that they were all fire-type plants. Hui Yuhao didn't know much about this mystical place, but he had been observing everything around him ever since he had arrived. He had discovered through his observations that the plants in this mystical cornucopia had their own hierarchy. The plants that were located closer to the ice-fire yin-yang well were either highly resistant to intense chill, or intense heat, or they were extremely compatible with these temperatures. That also meant the plants closer to the lake were stronger than the others. The delicate silk immortal and the blazing delicate apricot grew by the lake shore, and there was no doubt that these 2 flowers were some of the strongest entities in this place. The delicate silk immortal grew at a location near the lake's intersection, meaning her element was relatively neutral, and she didn't lean towards ice or fire. However, the blazing delicate apricot before him was undoubtedly the dominant one among all the fire-type plants, as she took up the central spot on the blazing sunspring's shore. The blazing delicate apricot quivered faintly as she said, Ultimate ice. It's no wonder you wants me to do it. Little guy, let me see if your ultimate ice is stronger, or if my ultimate fire is stronger." Hui Yuhao forced a laugh and replied, "That doesn't seem very fair, senior, as our cultivations are not equal in the first place. Furthermore, you have the blazing sunspring behind you that you speaks of, so my abilities will be greatly reduced. How could I be a match for you?" The blazing delicate apricot grunted and said, "Weren't you extremely courageous when you ingested the full moon piercing autumn dew? Why are you cowering away now?" Hui Yuhao answered seriously, "I'm not cowering away. The only thing is that book is extremely important to me, and I absolutely have to pass your test. Therefore, all I'm hoping for is that the test will be more just and fair. I also believe that you're not the kind to bully weaker individuals." The blazing delicate apricot said plainly, saying all that is useless. "My test has been predetermined, and what you shall face is an opponent that is equal to your ability's ultimate fire. However, your opponent will be supported by the blazing sunspring, and you will pass if you defeat your opponent. Otherwise, you can leave. The blazing delicate apricot leaned backwards vigorously as she spoke, and a peculiar fire-red whirlpool suddenly appeared in front of the flower. The whirlpool resembled a colossal whale sucking in water as it drew in a large pool of fire-red spring water from the blazing sunspring before firing the water into the air in a violent pillar. It was a pity that he had no time or space to curse. The searing pillar of water bore down on him as his spirit eyes stared ahead, and he could clearly feel how frightening this attack was. The blazing sunspring was so hot that even Ma Xiaotao's transformation into the darkness phoenix couldn't compare to it. This was true ultimate fire. The red pillar of water covered an enormous area, but Hu Yuhao didn't intend to meet force with force. He tapped on the ground with his foot, and his entire body sprang into the air like a lightning bolt. He twisted and somersaulted in the sky as he nimbly dodged the pillar. Some of the blazing spring water smeared across his Ice Empress armor, and some of the diamond crystals formed by the armor melted as a result. However, he managed to jump through an opening, and his left hand supported him on the ground as his body turned once more in midair. He tapped on the ground with his foot and changed directions as he leapt through yet another crack in the pillar. His spiritual detection had evolved, and this gave him even greater ability to grasp opportunities. He narrowly but impeccably evaded the blazing sunspring's attack. However, the scorching spring water didn't disappear when it landed on the ground. Instead, it congregated together strangely and instantly transformed into a humanoid figure. Hu Yuhao had initially believed that he would be facing the blazing delicate apricot. This was the reason why he was still on guard against her when he leapt through the air. Only now did he realize that his opponent was that fiery red spring water. The spring water congregated into a female human figure. Her features were faint and subtle, while there seemed to be a long red ponytail that draped all the way to her feet. Her figure was stunning, but it was a pity that the temperature emanating from her body was simply too frightening. The Fire Lady's body also became a little illusory. Hu Yuhao wanted to dodge to one side, but she followed his footsteps to the same side before she laid her flaming knives in front of him. It felt as if Hu Yuhao was about to slam himself into those flaming knives. Hu Yuhao finally started to curse. No matter how powerful his spiritual detection was, there was no way that the Fire Lady could make the same steps as he did, the ghost shadow perplexing track steps. Hu Yuhao vanished into thin air as his left leg flickered once with golden light, and he reappeared right behind the Fire Lady in the next moment. This was the instant teleportation that the wolf ape's left leg bone had given him. Instant teleportation was like a legendary skill to most soul masters, and its effects were most obvious when used in close combat. Aren't you trying to weaken my ultimate ice? Fine, then I won't use ultimate ice. Hu Yuhao slashed out with his right hand after he used instant teleportation, and his dark golden terraclaw's sharp edges reached out over 7 meters. The frightening blade seemed to howl as it flickered once when it slashed through the air, as if it were about to sever the world itself in two. One had to admit that combining instant teleportation and the dark golden terraclaw was simply unimaginably powerful. It was hard to avoid this attack even if his opponent could predict it. In the end, instant teleportation was just too quick, while the dark golden terraclaw's area of effect was too vast at the same time. The life-reflecting shield's defensive abilities were absolutely outstanding. However, its reflecting effect was definitely nothing much against the Fire Lady, who didn't have a life of her own. Furthermore, the Fire Lady was emanating ultimate fire, so Skydream's agonizing howls instantly rang out in Hu Yuhao's mind. The Fire Lady didn't have life, so the life-reflecting shield's most prominent feature of absorbing the opponent's life energy to reflect it back couldn't take effect at all. This naturally made Skydream extremely annoyed and frustrated. I can't use it anymore, I'll hurt Brother Skydream. Hu Yuhao exasperatedly realized the sorrowful situation he was in. Every single ability he possessed was being weakened as he continued to fight this Fire Lady. Hu Yuhao naturally wasn't willing to be passive, and he wasn't about to allow the Fire Lady to beat him down. The life-reflecting shield didn't hurt the Fire Lady, but it bought him enough time to make a comeback. Orange gold light flickered, and the little Snow Lady emerged behind him. The Snow Lady wasn't used to the searing environment around her, and her tiny eyebrows began to frown as she began to chitter. However, Hu Yuhao began to unleash his abilities at this moment. The Ice Empress Jade Scorpion's 5 soul rings lit up at the same time, 1 red, and 4 orange soul rings sparkled, as his ultimate ice was channeled to the highest possible level. His 4th soul ring sparkled brilliantly, and the Snow Lady's figure became a little illusory as the Snow Empress' arrogance descended upon the world once more. In the moment that the Snow Empress projection appeared, the Fire Lady in front of her and the blazing delicate apricot not far from where they were became a little listless. The Snow Empress was formed by the Ice Sky Snow Lady. Even though she didn't have her original body, she still retained some of the aura of her formidable 700,000-year cultivation. However, the pressure that Hu Yuhao felt suddenly increased exponentially. The release of the snowy dance of ultimate ice meant he was no longer just targeting the Fire Lady, he was going against the superheated environment around him. This also meant he was targeting the blazing delicate apricot and the blazing sunspring. The snowy dance of ultimate ice's mighty strength was limited to less than 30% of its original power inside this extreme environment. The scorching heat meant there was hardly any moisture in the air, and the temperature itself was incredibly high. Hu Yuhao's soul power was consumed continuously, as if it were leaking out of his body. The Fire Lady seemed to feel the immense threat borne by Hu Yuhao's snowy dance of ultimate ice, and she began to move the moment Hu Yuhao's domain was unleashed. However, this wasn't an attack. She began to move sideways with lightning speed as she darted rapidly towards the blazing delicate apricot. Hu Yuhao naturally directed his domain in pursuit of the Fire Lady. The snowy dance of ultimate ice was about to touch the Fire Lady. Large amounts of water vapor could be seen evaporating from the Fire Lady's body, while her scarlet gold colors swiftly grew dull. However, something interfered with Hu Yuhao's battle once again. Boom! The blazing sunspring seemed infuriated, and it exploded as if it were a mother trying to protect her kid. The burning red spring water surged into the sky. The blazing sunspring didn't retaliate against Hu Yuhao. The red spring water surged vertically into the air, but this sudden instance of extremely high temperature was enough to dispel half of Hu Yuhao's snowy dance of ultimate ice. The domain that was just about to envelop the Fire Lady naturally missed its target, and could only continue forward. The Fire Lady took this opportunity to run behind the blazing delicate apricot. The domain inevitably loomed over the blazing delicate apricot, and the flower's body erupted with an intense golden red light. What happened afterwards? There was no afterwards. The blazing sunspring and the blazing delicate apricot worked together against the snowy dance of ultimate ice, and the entire domain dissipated to the point where not a single snowflake remained. Hu Yuhao's cheeks were flushed red from the intense heat, and he stumbled backwards. Fortunately, the blazing sunspring's eruption only lasted for a single moment, and the temperature dropped back down once the red spring water returned to the well. However, the Fire Lady came out from behind the blazing delicate apricot, as she flashed her twin knives, and raced toward Hu Yuhao mercilessly. Fruobnovel.com. Wait! Hu Yuhao shouted at the top of his voice. What? The blazing delicate apricot sounded rather bored, and answered extremely casually. The corner of Hu Yuhao's mouth twitched as he said, "This is cheating, senior. The blazing sunspring's eruption can still be explained, because it was affected by my ultimate ice aura. But how am I to continue with this test if you interfere as well?" The blazing delicate apricot's attitude changed drastically the moment that high-power shell was fired. The Fire Lady was thrown backwards by the explosion, and the terrifying explosive energy expanded out instantly. The blazing delicate apricot lived up to her name as a 100,000-year soul beast. Ripples began to twist and contort in the air the moment she realized something was wrong, and the frightening explosive force was refracted in all directions by the contortions in the air, and the shockwaves blasted through the sky. At the same time, the blazing delicate apricot released a scarlet-red light tea from herself that formed a dome over her territory. This light absorbed every single ounce of the high-powered shell's explosive force. Hu Yuhao had definitely guessed how the blazing delicate apricot was going to react since he dared to do this, and his aim was to buy himself enough time. The Fire Lady was blown away, and she needed some time to come back, while the blazing delicate apricot was preoccupied with containing the shell's explosive force. She was caught off guard, so she couldn't control the Fire Lady in time. This was his opportunity. Freewebville.cm. 4 soul thrusters erupted behind Hu Yuhao's back. Hu Yuhao didn't choose to rush towards the Fire Lady hurtling through the air to destroy her while the blazing delicate apricot was distracted, because he knew that that was an impossible endeavor. The Fire Lady was hurtling towards the blazing sunspring, and she was practically invincible and undying over there, since she was made from the blazing sunspring's water in the first place. Therefore, the 4 soul thrusters behind Hu Yuhao began to fire downward. A frightening force instantly propelled his body into the air, and he rocketed high up into the sky. Hu Yuhao had already relied on this explosive acceleration to reach a height of 50 meters before the blazing delicate apricot recovered. His flying-type soul tool expanded behind him and brought him even higher into the sky as he flew upward. How is that possible? He only has 5 soul rings. How can he know how to fly? The blazing delicate apricot was a little dazed. She was confused as to how a 5-ringed human could fly through the air at such a high speed. "You've fallen behind," Hu Yuhao thought to himself. There was no longer an aggrieved look on his face, and a self-confident smile appeared in its place. The blazing delicate apricot looked on as Hu Yuhao's body flew more than 100 meters into the air. She could control her attacks to reach that height, but this fight was supposed to be between Hu Yuhao and the Fire Lady. The blazing delicate apricot could interfere from the side, but directly lashing out against Hu Yuhao was clearly not within the test's rules. Thus, she could only continue watching as Hu Yuhao flew even higher into the sky. She had no idea what he wanted to do. "Hey, you're cheating. You've lost, you've gone outside my territory." The blazing delicate apricot shouted at Hu Yuhao in the sky. Hu Yuhao answered, "No, I haven't. How have I left your designated area? I'm flying vertically in the air, but I'm still within your territory. I haven't stepped out of it. If I don't fly out of this vertical area, then I haven't lost. Am I right, senior? This test is still ongoing, you can't lie to me." Hu Yuhao placed another Class 5 explosive shell inside his heavy cannon as he spoke, and he trained the cannon barrel downwards. The blazing delicate apricot immediately burst out with red light, as she was still a little fearful of that fearsome explosive force. It wasn't much to her, and it definitely wasn't enough to wound her, but it could destroy the land around her. Land and soil were absolutely important to plants like them, and they were also right next to the blazing sunspring. If the soil and ground around the blazing sunspring was damaged and the hot spring water flowed out, the surrounding plants would be faced with a calamitous disaster. This wasn't something that she wanted to see. Hu Yuhao pulled the trigger right at this moment. A searing red sphere erupted once more, and barreled down towards the ground. However, the blazing delicate apricot was stunned when she realized that Hu Yuhao's wasn't firing at her. The shell arched through the air and landed in the distance. It was going straight for the extreme chill ice spring. The Snow Lady had released the Snow Empress projection when she unleashed the snowy dance of ultimate ice along with Hu Yuhao. However, it was different this time. The Snow Empress spirit seemed to be aging. She gradually became a little child, and then a teenage girl, before finally reverting to the Ice Sky Snow Lady's original appearance. Ice and snow covered her entire body, and was presented as the most beautiful and enchanting dress. Her large dark blue eyes were clear and deep, as if she could watch over the entire world. Long hair draped behind her back and became icy blue in color, and her hair seemed like eternal glacier. Intense cool immediately permeated the skies, and at this moment, the blazing sunspring's aura was completely suppressed by this frightening chill. Hu Yuhao was the one that had planned all this, but not even he had expected this to happen. He had determined his battle strategy after his meticulous observations before this. His goal was simple: the blazing delicate apricot and the Fire Lady are drawing strength from the blazing sunspring, and since this place is called the Icefire Yin-Yang Well, there is no question that other side is an ice spring, since the sunspring is on this side. The sunspring weakens me, while the ice spring will greatly amplify my abilities. Therefore, his high-power shell was aimed that way so that he could draw upon the ice spring's energy, and then he would use his snowy dance of ultimate ice again. He would give everything he had to strike down from the air and finish off the Fire Lady with a single strike. He had a chance to determine the outcome of this battle when the Fire Lady no longer had the sunspring's protection, and if he didn't let the blazing delicate apricot interfere. Who knew that this peculiar sight would happen once the tiny Snow Lady absorbed the extreme chill ice spring? The Snow Lady had grown up, and she had become the actual Ice Sky Snow Lady. The Snow Empress aura was so terrifying that even Hu Yuhao felt his heart quiver in fear, the 4 orange gold soul rings on his body sparkling with unprecedented intensity. Hu Yuhao felt the soul power in his body surging torrentially. At this moment, he felt as if he could actually rely on his soul power to fly. The Snow Empress glanced at Hu Yuhao. Her eyes were a little complicated. Her look seemed a little intimate and friendly, but there was also a little bit of contempt and rejection. However, she only gave him a single glance before she turned towards the blazing delicate apricot beneath her. The Snow Empress snorted coldly as she descended toward the giant flower. The Snow Empress raised her hands, and the icy white water from the extreme chill ice spring erupted 100 meters into the air as it became the Snow Empress background. Howling winds billowed above the Icefire Yin-Yang Well in the next moment as snowflakes waltzed through the air. The entire area around them immediately became enveloped in a whiteness that only snow could produce. A dome of light separated the extreme chill ice spring under the Snow Empress control, and it forcibly suppressed the blazing sunspring beneath it so that the hot spring's heat was completely blocked off. The Snow Lady's expression was icy as the ice spring's aura surged into her body rapidly. Hu Yuhao was still hovering in mid-air, and he felt as if his body was swelling up as the Snow Lady continued to absorb the ice spring's energy. No matter how much autonomy and consciousness the Snow Empress spirit had, she still had to rely on the host that she had signed a contract with. The Snow Empress aura continued to rise, but Hu Yuhao was almost reaching his limit. Hu Yuhao's body reached the point where it might explode from the overwhelming and terrifying ultimate ice if this was allowed to continue. "I can't take it anymore, Snow Empress," Hu Yuhao shouted at the top of his lungs. If he died, the Snow Empress would no longer have a host, and she would perish as well. The Snow Empress glanced at him, but she didn't seem to hear him as she pointed at him with her right hand. The little snow lady's familiar dark blue ice burst out, except it was exponentially larger than before, and it ended up beneath Hu Yuhao's feet before it froze into an enormous ice pedestal in midair, supporting his body so that he wouldn't fall. That ice pedestal hovered there along with the blizzard around them. Large amounts of ice and snow were falling to the ground. The plants around the ice spring were still all right, as they liked the cold, but the plants near the sunspring no longer had the sunspring's heat. They were starting to tremble in response to the ultimate ice's extremely low temperature, and most of them began to release their own auras to resist the ice and snow descending from the sky. Hu Yuhao felt as if his own blood was freezing, and his body was swelling to the point where it began to crackle. However, there was nothing he could do as the Snow Empress continued to unleash her aura. The gap in their abilities was simply too great. Punished. Ha 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 ha, scourged by the heavens. The Snow Empress' voice grew high-pitched and shrill. Even so, her voice was still as enchanting as ever. Punishment. I have been punished 6 times, and I am where I am today, because I had to avoid the 7th time. You dare to speak of punishment to me? Very well. I will settle your punishment before anything else, then. The Snow Empress gradually raised her right hand as she spoke. Her palm seemed like it weighed several tons as the torrential ice and snow in the air began to spin in a clockwise direction. It didn't take long before a colossal, an incredibly frightening tornado of ice and snow formed above the Icefire Yin-Yang well. The snowless glacier of the Snow Empress 3 ultimate techniques. If this palm was allowed to come down, it would possess the Snow Empress' full power. The Snow Empress possessed 700,000 years of cultivation, and she was ranked number 3 amongst the 10 great savage beasts. She was also the leader of the extreme north's 3 heavenly kings, no. The delicate silk immortal exclaimed in the distance. She wasn't the only one that reacted, as more than 20 immortal herbs shone with intense light around the Icefire Yin-Yang well. This light swiftly congregated in the air as an enormous barrier resisting the terrifying tornado of ice and snow that was about to fall from the sky. The Snow Empress grunted coldly as she raised her right hand until her palm was pointing towards the sky. It felt as if she were a ruler who was about to descend upon the world as she muttered coldly, "Do you actually think you can stop me?" "No, Snow Empress." Hu Yuhao's hoarse voice rang out. The Snow Empress' body quivered faintly. Even though she had recovered her memory and her powers, she was still Hu Yuhao's spirit after all. She could feel that Hu Yuhao's body was about to fall apart, so she no longer absorbed the extreme chill ice spring's origin energy. She couldn't entirely resist Hu Yuhao's will. "Shut up. Have you forgotten how they've treated you?" the Snow Empress asked coldly. Hu Yuhao struggled to reply, "This is a paradise for plants, and the heavens have gifted the Dolua continent with a miraculous Icefire Yin-Yang well. Furthermore, I have to find the yearning heartbroken grass for Donga to save her life. I refuse to continue living if she dies. When that happens, you will die, and even the Ice Empress won't be revived. Don't hurt them, Snow Empress. They meant no ill toward me." Hu Yuhao's other words didn't affect her much, but when he said Ice Empress, the Snow Empress' body finally quivered once more before she brought down the palm that had been raised high in the air. Her large and beautiful, but fearsome and murderous eyes were fixed upon the trembling blazing delicate apricot. Has he passed the test? This video will end here. Thank you for watching.